of the classical model. Now, classical model का हम one part कर चुके हैं, part 1, जिसमें मैं बता चुकी हूँ कि how do we derive the vertical aggregate supply curve of the classical model and what are the important assumptions, yeah, what are the important features जिसके basis पे classical model बना है, which is like wages and prices are perfectly flexible, output is fixed and determined in the labor market, there is perfect competition, there is full employment, there is full information. ये सारे tenets के ऊपर classical model खड़ा है. So now, but we didn't talk anything about the demand side. That classical model demand side को कैसे treat करता है? How does it, say that demand does not impact the economy? What is the theoretical justification of that? And that is what the classical model is based on, and that is what we are going to study today. So, what is the classical aggregate demand curve? Now, the classical aggregate demand curve is the QTM, which is the MV is equal to PY curve. Okay. So why is this the classical aggregate demand curve? So this is the quantity theory, is implicit theory of aggregate demand for output within the classical system. Okay, so implicit theory matlab that this is how within the system aggregate demand curve is assumed. We assume that this is how aggregate demand is calculated. It is not an explicit theory. So this is implicit theory. It is not an explicit theory, because we are not calculating the different components of aggregate demand, just like we do in the Keynesian function, consumption, investment, government expenditure, net exports. We're not adding them up and telling this is what the demand is. So that is an explicit theory. So we are not doing that. We are saying that these factors are actually not impacting aggregate demand, and aggregate demand is stable and constant. Okay, so we will come to that how are we saying this? So like I said that this is a very implicit sort of aggregate demand curve where we're not really calculating it. So Y is the full employment output, right? And we are assuming by Say's law that supply creates its own demand. Correct? So demand and supply mismatch is not really the problem of the classical model. They say that supply creates its own demand. Whatever is supplied will be demanded. And basically this function that MV is equal to PY, this function really determines prices, because Y is fixed in the short run, money supply is variable, V is also fixed in the short run, and P is variable. So as M increases, it is P which is changing or decreasing or increasing. So this QTM, which is the aggregate demand, so this is the aggregate demand function in classical model, and this is really just determining P. Okay, because Y is fixed by the supply curve. So if we have to draw this, MV is equal to PY. Now remember, this is in the PY space. The demand and the supply curve are to be drawn in the PY case. Now when we draw MV is equal to PY for a particular value of M, okay, so for a particular value of M, so P into Y is equal to M into V. So let's say MV is a constant. So P into Y is equal to MV will be a rectangular hyperbola, right? This will be a rectangular hyperbola, so it will look like this. And this is drawn for a particular value of M. So as M increases, this hyperbola will just shift out. Okay, so this is how the aggregate demand curve is looking like, and how if you put together the demand and the supply curves, then this is what happens. That you can this is the aggregate supply curve, and this is fixed vertical, which we derived in the last lecture, and this is the QTM, MV is equal to PY for a particular value of M, and the point at which the aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, that is the point where P is determined and Y is fixed. If money supply increases, then M increases, the whole aggregate demand curve shifts out, and at the new equilibrium prices are higher. So as M increases, price increases just by the QTM, right? Quantity theory of money, MV is equal to PY. Okay, so this is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Now, of course, we have to understand that how are the variables of consumption, investment, government expenditure not impacting. So C bar is a small factor. Let's say consumption is usually a function of income. Investment, government expenditure. So I bar can increase, G bar can increase. How are they not impacting aggregate output, right? That is the next question. That where did G bar, C bar, I bar go? So now we are going to address that question. So this is a small kind of table which shows at any time. The classical model was at any time there has been a hyperinflation. Hyperinflation means a crazy rise in price, a unbelievable rise in price, which is like 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 200, 300% rise in prices over a very short time span, a month, a few days. Okay, so any time there has been hyperinflation, money supply has always been the reason. So data has seen that in Germany, between August 2022 and November 2023, the monthly inflation rate was 322%. 322% was the inflation rate, and money supply growth in that same period was 314%. Similarly, in Hungary, between August 1945 and July 1946, inflation was 19,800% and the money growth was 12,200%. So money growth and price rise, hyperinflations have always gone hand in hand, which is why the empirically also the theory was with merit that so Milton Friedman has a very famous line that inflation is always and always a monetary phenomenon. So that has been clearly shown by the data also. Okay, so then now the question is that what about the other components of aggregate demand? Or what about consumption, investment, government spending? So aggregate demand, like we said in the Say's law, is always equal to full employment. So there's a particular full employment output, aggregate demand is equal to that, and it is fixed. So how are we showing that aggregate demand is fixed? What happens if G bar increases? What happens if I bar increases? So that is the question. So now in classical model, it is the onus is on interest rate to equate aggregate demand, to keep aggregate demand constant. Basically, to keep aggregate demand constant, the role is played by interest rate, and the theory that is developed by the classical economists is called the theory of loanable funds. It is called the theory of loanable funds. Okay, so now we're going to do the classical theory of interest or the theory of loanable funds. Okay, so now we are going to come to that. So so the theory of loanable funds, again, if I do it diagrammatically, I like diagrams. So this is the theory of loanable funds. So they are saying that in the economy there is a supply of loanable funds. What is the meaning of supply of loanable funds? Supply of loanable funds means that it is the supply of money which is available to anybody who wants to take a loan. Who wants to take a loan? Businesses want to take a loan. Okay, and so they want for investment. Government wants to take a loan because it wants to sometimes fund government expenditure. Okay, so so businesses and governments want to take a loan. So there is a so these are the entities which demand loanable funds. Okay, so they have a demand loan. These entities demand loanable funds, and the supply of loanable funds is coming from households. Okay, households like you and me. So the assumption is that if anybody wants to take a loan, they release bonds. Okay, they issue government bonds or corporate bonds. So they issue bonds. If people like the interest rate that which is being provided by the bonds, they will buy the bonds. Okay, they will buy the bonds, and so the money will be given to either the government or the private enterprise. And when they don't want to, when they want their money back, they will sell these bonds to get their money back. Okay, so that is how the supply of loanable funds, the theory of loanable funds works. So we'll start with a simple model. So this is, let's say, the demand for loanable funds, and this is the supply of loanable funds. So here we have the demand and supply of loanable funds here, and here we have the interest rate. Okay, so this is the downward sloping demand for loanable funds. So let's assume that government government demand for loanable funds is zero, and it is only the corporate demand for loanable funds which is for investment. So investment is downward sloping. Why is investment downward sloping? Investment curve is downward sloping because as your interest rate is high, the demand for investment is low. Why is that? So let's write that again. As interest rate is high, demand for investment is low. Why is that? Because every investment project has some rate of return, right? There are high rate of return projects, there are low rate of return projects. So if the interest rate, which is the cost, now interest rate is the cost, right? Interest rate is the cost. If the cost of funds is high, then only a few investment projects can be taken up, which can give a very high rate of return. But when the interest rate is low, a lot of projects can be taken up, which can also give lower returns than something. So if the rate of interest is 2%, you can take up a project which gives you a return of 10%. But if the rate of interest is 10%, then you can only take up a project which has a rate of return of 20%. So when the rate of interest is high, the demand for loanable funds for investment is low. When the rate of interest is low, the demand for investment for loanable funds is high. So it's a downward sloping curve. And on the other hand, the supply of loanable funds, S, is an upward sloping curve. If the rate of return on bonds is low, then less people will be interested in parting with their money and giving it away to the government or to corporates for investments. But if they offer a very attractive interest rate, we all will be tempted to invest the money in the bonds and purchase the bonds. So the supply of loanable funds is upward sloping and the demand for loanable funds is downward sloping. So now the question is that how is equilibrium? So equilibrium is so this rate of interest that is determined in the market is the rate of return which is being offered, should be offered on the bonds for this supply of loanable funds to match the demand for loanable funds. Okay, so this is what this model is saying. So right now this is what it is. If let's say, so abhi I've put government expenditure on the side, I'm just saying if let's say investment demand increases. Okay, suppose they're very favorable business, whatever, for some reason investment demand increases. Okay, so how is aggregate demand staying constant? We are going to see that. So investment demand increases. We are saying that in the economy, aggregate demand still stays constant. So how does that happen? So this is what happens. So this is the point of increase in investment demand, right? All right. So this was the point of increase in investment demand. The new equilibrium is at this value, I0 to I1. Okay, so you move from point A. Let's mark point A. You move from point A to point B. Okay, let's mark this point B. So when the economy, this is the shift in investment, right? Now, because of the shift in investment, the equilibrium interest rate has moved to B. Equilibrium interest rate has moved to I1, right? Now, so how has aggregate demand remained constant? That's the question. So what the classical model says that this was the shift. Let's say initially the shift was A to C. Because of the equilibrium increase in interest rate from I0 to I1, the final equilibrium increase was only from A to B. So this reduction in investment has already happened by itself because of the increase in interest rate. Okay, so this reduction in I bar. So some investment went down when interest rate went up. So so some reduction in investment itself has happened. So A to B is the net increase in investment, right? Now then to fund this investment, the supply of loanable funds has gone up from A to B, right? Let's say this point is B. So from A to B, the supply of loanable funds has increased. Now, if the supply of loanable funds have increased, that means people have increased their savings. And if people have increased their savings, that means by the same amount, consumption has fallen, right? So when investment increases, some investment falls and some consumption falls to keep the level of aggregate demand constant. Okay. So so this is the simplest way of explaining that aggregate demand remains fixed even if you increase I bar. When I bar increases, some investment falls, some C falls, and in the net, there is no change in aggregate demand. So this was without government expenditure. Now, let's say we add in government expenditure. So when you add in government expenditure, what happens is that a similar thing will happen. But when you add in government expenditure, what you only need to add is the part of G minus T. G minus T is government expenditure minus taxes. Okay, so if taxes go up, so this is the amount of government expenditure which could not be funded by taxes. This is the government deficit. Right? This is the government deficit which could not be funded by taxes. So this is the demand for loanable funds by the government. Okay, so we can add the demand for loanable funds by the government to this. So assume karo till initially there was no demand for loanable funds by the government. Now government expenditure went up, taxes remained constant, and there is a demand for loanable funds. Okay, so G bar has increased. Now how has aggregate demand remained the same? Let's see. So the same argument. Right now we were here. Let's say this is the increase in G bar. Okay, so let's call this point A, this point B. So from let's say 0 to B has been the increased in government expenditure. Okay. Now from 0 to A, the rate of interest has gone up. Okay. So investment has fallen from so the equilibrium rate of interest is now A, right? Investment is going to become lesser by that much amount. So from 0 to A, investment is now going to be lower because at this new interest rate, let's say this is the new interest rate, right? At this new interest rate, so this is the new demand for loanable funds, but investment is only till this much. So investment earlier was this much, now investment was this much. Okay, so this was the push increase in G. This is the increase in G, but up till this point, this side investment has fallen, right? So if G increases, some part of investment falls because of the rate of interest increases, right? And the second part, the argument is the same, that if you increase the supply of funds, to increase the supply of funds, your consumption has to fall. So again, when G also increases, investment and consumption fall to keep the aggregate demand constant. So the argument is that if one increases, the other decreases to keep the demand and supply for loanable funds as in equilibrium. This is that diagram in the book which explains the same thing, that some part will be fall in investment, some part will be fall in consumption. Okay, so of course the other argument, so this is what I just explained, that if government expenditure increases, then also the supply and demand of loanable funds will keep the aggregate demand as fixed. So now there are some other variable cases also, which I will explain. So when government expenditure increases, there are three ways of meeting this government expenditure. So one is tax increases. If tax increases, then the same thing, that if tax increases, then consumption is going to fall, right? If tax increases, then consumption will fall, and the effect of government expenditure, it will not be there. So basically G minus T is the supply of loanable funds, right? So G minus T, if G increases and T also increases by the same amount, then there is no change in the supply and demand of loanable funds. So there is no change in the aggregate demand also. Argument in a while. So we'll just finish this part, that in the classical model, there are two ways in which we are not letting the output be affected by aggregate demand. First is this interest rate, that this interest rate moves to equate demand and supply of loanable funds such that aggregate demand remains fixed. And the second is that output is completely dependent on the labor market, and as long as labor market is is in equilibrium, there will be full employment of output and there will be no effect of aggregate demand. Okay, so now let's go to what I was saying that time, that if G increases and it is accompanied by a tax increase, so most of the increases so the consumption will fall. That is the first thing that will happen. So this will be kind of the T increase and the C decrease will kind of offset most of it. And the other is that when tax increases, it also impacts the supply side of the economy. So it just does not impact the demand side of the economy. So tax has both demand and supply side effects. Okay, whether tax increases or tax decreases. If tax increases, then people will have less incentive to work. So the labor supply, if you have like the labor demand and the labor supply curve, when tax increases, the labor supply will shift back and you will have a lower output. So your whole aggregate supply curve will shift back. And if you have a tax decrease, then people will have more incentive to work and the labor supply curve will shift out and you will have a higher employment level. You will have a higher aggregate supply level. So a tax has a supply side effect, a very big supply side effect. So tax is not something that can be changed very, very easily. So tax has both. It has demand side effect and it has a supply side effect. So now, as long as we consider the effect on demand, let's do the tax side effect properly. So it obviously, if you decrease tax, the disposable income of households would decrease. So let's say you can do an expansionary fiscal policy by just decreasing the per unit tax. if you decrease tax, then like I said, supply side may the labor supply will shift out and income will increase. On the demand side, as tax increases, if tax decreases, then public can increase consumption expenditure. But it is the same thing, that if you fund this tax decrease by taking a loan or issuing bonds to the public, then interest rate will increase, investment will fall, and if savings increase, then consumption will fall, and again the net effect is not left. Okay, so the end of the story is that because everything is interrelated, the net effect would be that there is no increase in demand in case there is a tax fall also, but the tax fall is accompanied by government issuing bonds and raising the interest rate. So everything is dependent on that. Okay, so this channel has to be clear that if let's say tax falls, consumption increases, but government has to issue bonds to meet the deficit, and then interest rate will increase, and if interest rate increases, investment will fall, savings will increase, but also consumption will also fall. So there will not be much benefit as such. The other is that the government can increase government expenditure, but it can do so by printing money. If it prints money, then money supply increases, and if money supply increases, then the only thing that will happen is that the aggregate demand curve will shift out and the price will increase in the economy. Okay, so that is the other effect of increasing money supply. That is why it is only the increase in money supply which has shown to increase aggregate demand. So remember, this is the aggregate demand curve, right? This is the AD curve which we had talked about. So if money supply increases, then the AD curve shifts out. But when the AD curve shifts out, the only change that happens is that output remains constant, and it is the prices which go up. So whether it is an expansionary, so if there is an expansionary monetary policy, okay, if it is an expansionary monetary policy, then it is the money supply which will go up, but that will only increase prices and not affect output. That is what classical model said. And if you increase government spending, but to meet the deficit, you increase the money supply, same thing. The aggregate demand will go up by the amount of increase in government spending and the amount of increase in money supply. The aggregate demand will go up, but it will only be matched by an increase in price, and nothing will happen to output. So that is how the classical model works. And so this is where I was talking about the fact that if taxes fall, then the labor supply curve will shift out, output will rise, and we will have the whole aggregate supply curve can shift out in that case, in case taxes fall. So taxes have a supply side and a demand side effect. Okay, and money supply, like we've talked about, can only increase prices. It does not impact output or employment in the short run or the long run. All right, so so this is the end of this chapter. So most important points to remember in this chapter are that government expenditure increase, investment increase does not change aggregate demand. The only thing that changes aggregate demand is increase in money supply, which in turn only increases prices because output is fixed. Okay, so that is what we have done in this chapter, and that the aggregate demand curve for the classical model is the QTM MB is equal to PY, which is an implicit function. It is not an explicit function. We're not calculating aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is just equal to aggregate supply at Y, and this function only determines prices. All right, so this is the end of the classical model as given in Freud, and watch out for the next videos. We'll get more and more videos explaining a whole big chapter to you in the simplest of terms. All the best.